With set 8 around the corner, I think it's a good time to look back at the entirety of set 7 and judge whether the new mechanic of this set, Dragons, was a good addition or not. Let's start by looking at set 7. So of course Dragons were introduced in set 7 and as such was an exciting new mechanic to play and use. But once you play Dragonlance more, you realise how bad Dragons actually were. The set didn't really feel very expansive and diverse, as when you looked deeper into the new mechanic that supposedly introduced 7 new unique units, you realize they boil down to just 3 characters. Xiaoyu and Deja are chromas of the Dragon Guardian Galio skin line, sy'fen is Dark Flame Shyvana and Idis is a Championship Shyvana chroma, and Alshin is the base version of the Storm Dragon Aurelion Soul skin. Initially Dragons were exclusive and could not be played together, which initially seemed to be a good balanced choice, as this prevented you from regularly being able to field a board of dragons, which would be like playing a board of legendary units. Hypothetically, this would be insane, especially in earlier stages. But in reality, these units taking 2 team slots was a massive drawback to your board, and so the exclusivity of dragons wasn't really necessary at all. And this exclusivity caused comps to be extremely linear, as they would always be focused on a single dragon, and the path you would take to get that dragon would rarely change from game to game. Dragons only really shared itemization options with each other, so the goal would be to 2-star a dragon as soon as possible, and then you would rarely ever pivot off to another 4 or 5 cost carry. This is what I mean by linear. The path from early to late game was way too straightforward, as players already decided their late game board in stage 2 or 3, as their augment and item choices were for a specific dragon. But some dragons were extremely unreliable, particularly the 10 costs like Aurelion Soul, who's tied very heavily to a mage spat to be impactful, and Shyvana, whose ult had incredibly unreliable targeting and could jump to the backline and then walk away and ult a single frontliner. Shyvana's damage also scaled off the enemy unit's HP, so it was even more unreliable, as enemy units usually didn't have a lot of HP, so Shyvana's damage was just pitiful. This meant that flexing between dragons was almost a non-existent concept in this set, as the best dragons were Xiaoyu, sy'fen, and if you had enough gold, Alshin. Both Xiaoyu and sy'fen completely dominated the early patches, and prevailed as the best and most reliable dragons. Although back then sy'fen's ult, which needed a lot of mana to cast, could also be dodged. This 2 gold difference between the epic and legendary dragons may seem small, but holding the cheaper dragons didn't impact your econ nearly as heavily as holding the legendary dragons. 10 cost dragons took you an entire interest interval down, which slows down your econ tremendously. It was much easier to meet the interest breakpoints with 8 cost dragons, so 2-starring the 8 cost dragons was far easier, as you would usually have the econ to do so, which in turn makes these dragons better from game to game, as you can reliably 2-star them. So as the cheaper dragons were much more impactful and much more reliable, players' boards could spike astronomically if they high rolled and hit them at lower levels or earlier stages. This could easily enable win streaks for these players to then hit higher levels and 2-star their dragons. But generally, dragons were ridiculously expensive and could cripple your economy if you were holding any. Having the most powerful and impactful units be late game units meant that leveling and looking for these units would naturally be the better choice. So this would push reroll comps down, which also meant that 3-star units needed to be stronger than usual to match the pseudo power creep that dragons introduce. So some reroll comps were very strong and dominant due to their reliability and consistency, like reroll Ezreal, reroll Nami, and some were absolutely obscene like Scale Scorn with Olaf and Diana, which was especially absurd if you gave Olaf an assassin spat. Also, there weren't many augments specifically for dragons. In fact, there were only 2, which were Dragon Alliance and Dragon Horde. These augments were far too similar to each other, and the difference was barely perceivable, which meant that it could be confusing as to which would be a better choice. The lack of augments for dragons was disappointing and dull, as the way you play dragons would rarely change from game to game. Dragons were a fun and exciting new mechanic in set 7, but when you took off the rose-colored glasses, you realized how heavily dragons stunted the diversity of comps and how linear and boring the comps became. So this leads me to conclude that dragons were a bad addition to the set. While it brought some interesting units, only being able to play a single dragon restricted your options significantly, and was a poor preemptive restriction on Riot's part as it held dragons back. It also took too long to make all the 10 cost dragons viable and reliable options. Shyvana was the last to be addressed with a targeting fix in 12-15, but this was 2/3 of the way through the set. This alone made the cheaper dragons better choices throughout the set, and that's not including how strong these units were in certain patches. So dragons clearly had potential, but the execution was lackluster at best. However, the mid-set completely changed the game. And this is primarily because the mid-set fixed the major issue with set 7 and allowed dragons to be playable together, and even introduced a vertical trait to dragon. This was a massive change as comps were no longer stifled, and so many more comps were now possible as you no longer needed to get a specific augment to be able to use the new dragon mechanic however you wanted to. The confusing Dragon Horde and Dragon Alliance augments were removed and some of the power was moved into the dragon traits. This helped redistribute the power of dragons, and you had to actually invest in dragons to get some of that power back. There were also the addition of more dragon augments, specifically Dragon Soul, Dragon Imperialist and Age of Dragons. So now the way you play dragons could actually change from game to game. This mid-set also introduced 5 new dragons, that being Zippy, Nomsy, Swain, Som and Terra. These dragons were notable as they were all distinct and unique units and expanded vastly on the dragon mechanic, as there were many more dragons you could actually play. This was a massive improvement on the last set, as a number of dragons made Dragonlance actually feel like Dragonlance. Dragons became cheaper, so holding dragons to 2-star or even 3-star them wasn't nearly as detrimental to your economy. This also justified small nerfs to each dragon to rein in their power. This, combined with a larger dragon pool, made high-rolling dragons less impactful as the power of dragons was diluted. The power creep of dragons had an interesting effect in this mid-set, where some of the lower cost units were buffed so they could be more viable, which were units like Ezreal, Karma and Kai'Sa. Now this was interesting because now these units could contend with significantly more expensive boards and even beat them reliably. This brought the balance to a very good spot in patch 12.20, where dragons and reroll comps both felt viable and accessible. Of course, you could say this is a little too late with set 8 right around the corner, but achieving such a delicate balance was an incredible feat and should be commended. Admittedly, some 3-star units were absurd, particularly Dragomancers like Kai'Sa and Karma, as Dragomancer gave them a lot of HP, which was very difficult to get through, but this was addressed in subsequent patches. This isn't to say the mid-set was perfect. Alshin suffered a bit in the mid-set as Ornn being removed made Vertical Tempest very awkward to play. In fact, there was never a Tempest comp that prevailed in this set. Also, it took until 12.19 to get the dragon trait right, as prior to this patch it was not worth investing past 2 dragon. I went into detail about this issue in this short, so check it out if you want to hear more. Likewise, before 12.19, the Dragon Soul augment was one of the worst augments in this set because of how bad Vertical Dragon was. Of course, 12.19 was released and fixed this issue, but 12.19 introduced more issues where 6 dragons was ridiculously strong, and when a player hit, they completely dominated their lobby. But that doesn't mean dragons just dominated at 6. There were many dragon comps, mostly at 4 dragon, that were very dominant as well. And this was due to Terra and Idus alone giving your board an extreme amount of value, as they were both reliable tanks, but Idus also granted a Shimmer Scale item and Terra granted damage reduction hexes. Playing additional dragons around these two and your augments and items was a very simple thing to do. So it made sense that dragon comps dominated as they were very easy to play, but you would also usually have just enough items for all your dragons. Dragons taking 2 team slots actually gave more value to your items, because instead of having just a normal unit with items and an unitemized unit, you now have a super unit with those items. So of course a board of these super units with items will perform very well. Strategies or augments that allowed you to get to higher levels quickly became very valuable in this set, so you could get dragons on your board as soon as possible. However, even considering that, the mid-set still went miles to greatly improve upon the dragon mechanic. It did take a while, but 12.20 was the patch where the set was finally coming together. Of course, there were issues like Dragonmancer and certain augments, however the execution of dragons in this set was vastly superior to that of the previous set, and this mechanic actually felt good to play in this set. Although a problem across both sets is that Soraka 3 was always better than any 3-star dragon. So why would you ever go for a 3-star dragon when you could go for a 3-star Soraka, which is far cheaper and far stronger? Also, if you didn't like dragons and you didn't like playing them, well, then you're out of luck, because you likely didn't have much success avoiding these units as they are the core mechanic of set 7. That would be the equivalent of picking an augment that does absolutely nothing, or choosing to not make or use items in your games. My friend, who hated dragons, didn't find this set enjoyable at all. so he just stopped playing set 7 altogether and began waiting for set 8. So dragons were a polarizing mechanic that you either liked and continued playing the set, or didn't and began waiting for set 8. While most players probably enjoyed and liked dragons, there are those who didn't enjoy them, and as such this mechanic split the player base, which is rarely ever a good thing to do. Dragons caused this set to be very inflexible, as your late game board would almost always have a dragon. Dragons encourage players to commit to a comp early regardless of what they roll, because they picked items and augments for that comp already. So the existence of dragons encouraged many players to rarely pivot their carries, as they quite frankly can't, as dragons don't really share itemization overlaps with other units. I personally think that dragons were categorically bad in set 7, but the mid-set salvaged them and made them infinitely more viable and fun to play. But I still think dragons were just innately flawed. So I do think dragons were a mistake, but some good lessons were learned from this set that will improve TFT in the future, like replayability and hyper carries. But now I'll leave the question with you. How do you feel about dragons? Were they a bad mechanic or were they really good? Let me know what you think and I'll catch you in the next one.